speaker today is Dale Carlson. He's an author, a photographer, and an architectural historian. And he's presenting on Albert Kahn residences, as you can see there. Dale tells me he was born on, as he put it, on the northeast shore of Lake Michigan. But I think of that more as the northwest coast of the Lower Peninsula. I think it's in the Traverse City area, I think. But early in life, he became interested more so in the history of the southeast Michigan area. He'll maybe tell you more about that. And he moved down here, made his permanent home here in 2004, and lives in the Berkeley area. Mr. Carlson, in the 1990s, studied at 4 different universities here in the area, including Michigan State. He studied journalism and graphic design, and he also obtained a photographic technology degree from Oakland Community College. He lectures regularly to groups like this in different libraries, different historical societies, I think mainly in the southeast Michigan area. In fact, he was here, some of you may have seen him in September. He presented here at the library 6 months ago on the topic of intersections, where architecture meets live performances in the Metro City. He's the author of 3 books that I could at least find. Maybe there are more, but he's got a lot more on display there. But most of them are called A Field Guide to Something. The first one is Corrado Parducci, A Field Guide to Detroit Architectural Sculptor. And then Kahn's Detroit, A Field Guide to Albert Kahn Designed Residences and Designs in the Metro area. And one, I believe, on New Orleans, stained glass in New Orleans. He'll probably tell you more about those. And in addition to all the lectures he gives, and that's like dozens every year, all over the southeast part of Michigan, he is a member of the Berkeley Historical Committee. So I'm sure you'll enjoy his presentation. I tried to get it moved outside, but he told me the slides would not project very well in the sunshine. But, anyway, welcome Dale Carlson.
Hi everyone, how's it going today? Great crowd. Thank you so much for coming out on a really nice spring day where probably being outside maybe looks a little bit more attractive. My name is Dale A. Carlson. I am the author of Kahn's Detroit, A Field Guide to Albert Kahn Designs of the Metro Area, and I've been invited by the Bloomfield Historical Society to lecture to you today about Albert Kahn residences of the Metro Area. Before I get too far into my lecture, I would like to thank the Bloomfield Historical Society for bringing me out for the first time, David Bogart especially, who organized most of the logistics bringing me here today, and also the Bloomfield Township Public Library for providing the space that we're meeting in today. So thanks to you all very much. I am going to break down my lecture to you today into 4 sections. I'm going to give you a bio of myself and how my books came about and how I attained my expertise in the fields of state and Detroit architectural history. For the sake of those in the audience who don't know a lot about Kahn, we're going to do a short biography of Kahn that lets you know about how he achieved worldwide influence in the field of architecture, working primarily out of the Detroit area. We're going to look at 15 residences designed by Kahn over the course of his career, which is really only scratching the surface. He's got about 70 out there. And we'll finish it all off with a Q&A. So let's start with my bio. My interest in the state and the city's architectural history, it starts off in the early 1990s when I leave my boyhood home of Traverse City to attend school in East Lansing at Michigan State University. And back then, I had a lot more hair. And one of my favorite things to do back then was drive from East Lansing to Detroit almost every weekend to take in what was a really super groundbreaking and exciting Detroit and techno house music scene. And as a bright-eyed youth visiting Detroit regularly for the first time in my life, I was definitely struck by the epic scale and proportion of the buildings I was seeing as compared to my modest hometown of Traverse City. And architectural history, it became a hobby of mine for about 20 years. But I started taking it a lot more seriously around 2012 when I met a fella through online correspondence by the name of Einar E. Kavarin. Einar is Icelandic by descent, which accounts for his slightly uncommon name. And I did end up meeting him in person a couple times in Arizona since first meeting in 2012. Well, Einar, he lived in the Detroit area from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and he is also a person with a great interest in Detroit's architectural history. And we met through online forums about Detroit architecture, and over the course of our correspondence, he eventually revealed to me that in the 1990s, he hunted down the son of a really well-known architectural sculptor by the name of Corrado Parducci. The son was in his 80s, living in Los Angeles, Pacific Palisades, and the son allowed Einar to photocopy his father's original studio ledgers from his studios in Detroit, enumerating over 600 commissions, as well as a scrapbook containing over 700 images of Parducci sculpture created over the course of his career, as well as a lot of personal touches in a personal scrapbook of his. Well, once I found out about the scrapbooks and the ledgers, the gears of my mind began turning, and it didn't take long for me to decide I wanted to write a book about Parducci. He's a super well-known figure in the annals of Detroit architectural history. No one had yet written a book about him, and I felt a responsibility to do something epic with these research materials that just fell in my lap. There were a lot of bumps in the road along the way. I started off on this project in 2013, and I finally got the book out in January of 2020, followed it up with a second edition in May of 2020. And it was the experience of writing this book that really taught me what it takes to be a good architectural historian, to hunt down the right historical sources, to really be able to well defend the attributions for the art that is presented in my books. It was also such a fulfilling experience that I immediately followed up in the 2 years after with 2 more books. The first, a field guide to Kahn's designs of our area, and also a field guide to stained glass of the New Orleans area. That's a city that is probably number 2 on my list of favorite cities, right below Detroit, and I spent a lot of time there. I lived about half the year in 2020 living in New Orleans, gathering the materials, the photography for that book. Well, now you guys know a little bit about how I attained my expertise. Let's look at our subject for the evening, Albert Kahn. And I am going to wet my whistle with a real quick drink of water before I get too far into it. Hold on one second. Albert Kahn is born in the town of Raunen, Germany in 1869. It's approximately halfway between Frankfurt and Luxembourg. He is the oldest of 8 children to be born to the Kahns, and his family spends the first 6 years of his life here in Raunen. They immigrate to Echternach in 1875, spend another 6 years there, and in 1881 the family immigrates to the United States. Approximately half of the Kahn children are born at this point. They spend a couple years in the U.S., and Kahn gets a job with the firm of Mason & Rice in 1884, and it becomes his first long-term job working for an architectural firm. This is a really fortunate circumstance for Kahn because one of the firm's namesakes, George D. Mason, is one of the most important architects in Detroit's history, in Michigan's history. Mason & Rice designed the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island, and in later years, as a solo firm, George D. Mason designs the Detroit Masonic Temple, 2 of the state's most important buildings, just to give you an idea of what great luck Kahn has getting a position in this office. Mason takes Kahn under his wing, and he gradually rises up the ranks in their office until he is promoted to chief designer in 1891. He holds this position for approximately 1/2 of a decade, and in 1896 he sets out on his first corporate partnership, Nettleton, Kahn, and Trowbridge. Trowbridge leaves the very next year to head the architectural department at Cornell University, a very prestigious job. And in 1899, maybe it's 1900, Nettleton passes away at a very young age. I believe it was 39 or 40. I can't remember right off the top of my head. But Kahn is on his own again, and he reunites with Mason for 1 year in 1901 to form the corporation known as Mason and Kahn. And during that year, Kahn designs 2 buildings that are very important to his development as one of the most important architects of the area. And those 2 buildings are the Palms apartment building, just outside of 375 on East Jefferson, just a tiny little bit east of downtown Detroit, and also West Hall on the Diag of the University of Michigan, also known as the West Engineering Building. And the reason these buildings are so important is because Kahn designs them using reinforced concrete. And in the early parts of his career, the use of reinforced concrete is really what sets Kahn and his brother Julius's company, Truscon, apart from other competitors in building design in the area. In fact, the success of these 2 buildings raises enough eyebrows and gets enough interest in Kahn that he's hired to produce some buildings in the reinforced concrete mode at the Packard plant at Grand and Concord in Detroit, a plant that's coming down as we speak, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. But Kahn's first round of designs at the Packard are mill construction. This precedes reinforced concrete, but in 1909, he produces his first reinforced concrete building at the plant, and it's a revolutionary opening of space within the building to both factory floor production and also the daylight coming in. They could make larger window openings using this mode. Well, it really sets Kahn up to be the premier designer of automotive manufacturing facilities in Southeast Michigan at a time when the industry is just absolutely exploding. And over the next 3 decades, Kahn designs 3 plants that impart a massive influence on the evolution of architectural design worldwide. This influence is best exemplified by the Ford Highland Park plant in Detroit that used to produce Model Ts, the River Rouge plant in Dearborn, built primarily in the 1920s, and the Chrysler half-ton truck plant in Warren, built in the mid to late 1930s. And the sparse, unornamented look of these buildings and the fact that they make little attempt to disguise the interior structural engineering, this looks really, it resonates with a group of European architects known as the Modernists. And the Modernists, the most important of them without question, is Walter Gropius, because Gropius goes on to found the Bauhaus School of Architecture in Weimar, Germany, which ends up being one of the most important architectural schools in the history of architecture. And we can see from Gropius's Fagerswerk shoe factory in Elfeld, Germany, built right after the Highland Park plant is completed, that he is definitely attempting to emulate the look of Kahn's steel sash window walls that are so common to these constructions of the era. Well, the modernist ideas about architecture, they really coalesce in the mid-20th century into a style of designing and constructing really large buildings that becomes known as the international style. And the international style is really well represented in the Detroit area from a variety of angles. First of all, Philip Johnson, he's the guy who coins the term international style in a book he co-writes in the 1930s, and he's got a building right on Detroit's skyline. It used to be called America Tower. It's now known as Ally Bank Tower. He's got the beautiful PPG Place in Pittsburgh, and these designs are a little bit more historicist than they are international. They're from late in his career, but I bring Johnson into the discussion because he's got a huge building on Detroit's skyline, and he's the person that coins the term. In Dearborn, the Ford World Headquarters is considered an absolutely quintessential example of the international style, despite its use of color. You usually don't see that in international style buildings. And also working out of our area right here, Bloomfield Hills, in the latter half of the 20th century, is a Finnish architect by the name of Eero Saarinen, and he is designing buildings in the international style for construction all over North America and Western Europe. He, just as a few examples, designs the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, the Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C., and the TWA terminal of JFK Airport in New York City. All really super influential, important designs. Well, I am actually not the most qualified person to draw a straight line from Kahn through the modernist and into the international style. So I would like to recommend a couple books for you tonight by people that have more thoroughly researched and more convincingly argued for Kahn's influence upon the modernists. And the first of these books I'd like to recommend is Albert Kahn, Architect of Ford by Federico Bucci. This is first published in Italian in 1991, translated to English in 1993. And also in 2001, the University of Michigan Museum of Art has a retrospective of Kahn's life and work. It's called Inspiration for the Modern, and they produce a guidebook that accompanies the retrospective with essays by 4 contributors that, again, tell the story of Kahn's influence on subsequent generations of building designers in a much more eloquent and detailed fashion than I can do in the short time that we have here tonight. So some people try to greatly simplify the story of Kahn's influence upon modern architecture by saying simply that Kahn developed a horizontal mode of design that these European architects basically tilted 90 degrees and moved into a vertical mode, and that's where we get the glass and steel skyscraper look of North American and Western European skylines of the latter half of the 20th century. Now, this is a massive oversimplification of Kahn's influence, but there are some small nuggets of truth in it as well. So just want to give you a sense of how Kahn is recognized for his influence on the evolution of architectural design internationally. But it's not just that. Kahn is unique among architects because he also exerts a huge influence on world history in general, and not many architects can make that claim. Kahn's influence on world history is best exemplified by 3 factory installations, the first being the Ford Willow Run Bomber Plant in Ypsilanti Township, constructed in the early 40s. Both these buildings here are demolished. I was lucky to get them before they went down around 2015. There's still a couple buildings at Willow Run remaining, but most of them are gone. And we also have the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, also constructed in the 1940s. And these plants are constructed in anticipation of the United States becoming more greatly involved in World War II, which obviously happens. And when we hear the phrase arsenal of democracy thrown around, these plants are the most literal embodiments of this phrase, arsenal of democracy. Detroit, at the time of World War II, has about 2% of the nation's population, but produces about 10% of the nation's munitions. So really super important plants, but it's not just what Kahn does stateside. In the Soviet Union in the late 20s and early 30s, he sends a team of his architects and engineers to live in the Soviet Union for a few years and educate Soviet engineers in the art and science of designing and building massive plants. And they help them build a lot. Some people cite the number as over 500. And these are really super epic sized plants, as we can tell from these original drawings from Kahn's offices. And they're originally built to build tractors, because Russia wants to lift itself out of its almost purely agrarian economy and become more automated and industrialized like the United States. The first step is to increase your farm production. So building tractors at first, but no one is really that surprised. In the mid-30s, as the storm clouds of war gathered, the Russians, they transform a bunch of these factories into wartime production and start producing tanks there, and they produce a lot. And for those of you who don't know, the Russian sacrifice in terms of human life in World War II, it greatly dwarfs any other nation on earth by a long shot. The Russians lose 10 million to direct military conflict, and 10 million more in collateral damage. This 20 million is 15% of their nation's population at the time, which is an absolutely mind-blowing statistic. The United States, by contrast, loses approximately 500,000 people to World War II. So the Soviet contribution on the Eastern Front in World War II, without it, it's very easily arguable that the Nazi scourge is never fully vanquished and that we're still seeing Nazi influence in mainland Europe to this day. The Russian contribution to the war effort is regularly recognized in the Western press, as exemplified by this headline in the Detroit Free Press leading up to VE Day in 1945. And for that reason, I describe these adaptive renovations to Kahn Design plants in Russia to be the most important adaptive renovations to ever be applied to any Albert Kahn building anywhere. So that's how Kahn exerts an influence on world history in addition to the evolution of architectural design. But I do want to note before I move on further that although Kahn's factory designs do impart a massive influence on the evolution of design, his commercial, residential, and memorial designs do not. They're competent plus, they're excellent, beautiful, well-constructed, but they don't have the worldwide influence that his factories do. But that really underscores why I write lectures like this, because to me, as a Metro Detroiter, Kahn's influence on our daily cultural life is actually more fascinating to me than his influence. Oops, I'm so sorry. Lost my battery from my remote there. Give me 1 second, folks. It's actually more interesting to me than his, let me make sure I got this on. Yep, I still do. His influence on the evolution of design worldwide. So Kahn was unbelievably connected with the upper crust of Detroit society during his lifetime. He knew all the movers and shakers. That's another reason I write lectures like this, because I want it to be clear just how deep Kahn's influence went beyond just designing buildings. There's an influence on daily cultural life in Detroit too that's undeniable. So let's move on now to the residences, and we're going to look at 15 tonight, and 9 of them are going to be right here in Oakland County, a couple very close to where we're sitting right now. We are going to start off in the city, though, with 3 structures that have been demolished for many years. They're all designed in Kahn's early years in the offices of Mason and Rice. And one might wonder how we are able to prove that Kahn designed them. Well, there's not incontrovertible proof out there, but what's really important is a book by a guy named W. Hawkins Ferry that's published for the Detroit Institute of Arts in 1970s to accompany a different Kahn retrospective. And in this book, Hawkins Ferry asserts that Albert Kahn designed these homes as his first residential designs while in the employ of Mason and Rice as their head designer. So when Ferry makes an assertion like this, we usually take him at his word. He's got a few flaws in his career, but for the most part, he's the most important architectural historian in Detroit's history. So let's start off with the Gilbert Lee residence, and you'll note that we've got a great catalog of photos thanks to the Burton Historical Collection and the fact that these were very prominent citizens in Detroit at the time they were built. Ferry Street, 2 of these homes are on Ferry Street. It's a really affluent neighborhood to live in at that time. Maybe still is a little bit to a certain degree. Let's get a couple more looks at Gilbert Lee's residence here. Real nice. Don't normally get this good of a photo record for demolished homes. No close-ups on the sculpture, unfortunately, which is oftentimes my favorite part of a design this old. Well, Gilbert Lee, he earns his money in Detroit as the president of Lee, Cady & Smart, a really big grocery firm, but he's also the head of the area organization of grocers. I got to look at it, the Michigan Wholesale Grocers Association. So he's got his hands in quite a few endeavors, and he makes a lot of money over the course of his career. And in this era of American history, when you make a lot of money, well, you use a lot of it for capital investments in banks, and you get on the boards, and you wield a lot more power and make a lot more money that way. So Lee first appears on a board in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but he really starts getting heavy into this kind of thing by the 1920s. And I want you to pay special attention to the clippings on the far left. The one on the very far left is for the First National Bank, and the second one is for the Security Trust Company. And I include these because they underscore Kahn's close connection with the people for whom he designs residences. There's also a business connection there too. And almost certainly Kahn's early association with Lee leads to him getting these commissions for the Security Trust Building and the First National Bank Building right down in Detroit's financial district in the 1920s. So when we look at a Kahn design, we almost always find evidence of other types of commissions that Kahn is creating for the person in question. These buildings also happen to have great sculpture on them by Parducci and other artisans from New York City associated with Parducci during his early career. So really lovely. A few more specific details about Lee. He's born in Romeo, Michigan in 1861. He comes to the Detroit area in 1879. Like many industrial leaders of the time, he's very hyperactive socially and takes part in a lot of clubs. That way you meet a lot of people, a lot more bigger pool of clients there. Very dramatically, he dies of a heart attack at a board meeting in 1930, right there in front of his partners. Seems like a scene right out of a Hollywood movie. He was survived only by his wife, and he is buried at Woodlawn Cemetery. I have not yet hunted down his grave, which is something I like to do with lectures like that, but you'll see the grave sites of a few other people along the way here. Our second residence we're going to cover tonight is the William Livingstone residence. It used to stand at John R. and Elliott. It was demolished in 2007. Again, designed during the Mason and Rice era of Kahn's career. Again, great photos in the Burton Historical Collection that you guys can find online pretty easily if you care to look it up. This one we do get an architectural sculptural detail, which I think is absolutely wonderful. We also get a full bloom summer shot, and it shows that Livingstone used to allow his walls to become ivy covered. But unfortunately, this home met with a bitter end. It stood dilapidated in the Brush Park neighborhood for many, many years, and many local architectural historians hoped for its revival, but it never happened. But in its latest years, it started caving in to itself, and local architectural historians gave it a nickname, Slumpy, that it had the last few years before it was finally put out of its misery, mercy killing. Livingstone came to Detroit in 1849. He came from Ontario, and there's a lot of westward expansion that applies to Detroit's history because a lot of guys that make it rich in the late 19th, early 20th century in Detroit do come west from Canada to find success here. He was the president of the Lake Carriers Association, a really super important organization that, you guessed it, manages and controls shipping on the Michigan lakes. His obituary says next to Henry Ford, he was probably the most widely known man in Detroit. I think that's a little bit hyperbolic, but not too far off the mark. Died of heart disease in 1925, survived by 3 sons and 4 daughters, buried at Woodmere Cemetery. I have found Livingstone's gravesite, but I haven't added it to the lecture yet. So maybe you guys come up for this lecture again at a different location sometime in the next year, and you will see Elliott's gravesite added to the images. Well, just to back up that statement about him being really famous, he does get on the front page of the Free Press the day after he dies. So he is very, very well known, but maybe not the second most famous person in Detroit at that time. One of my favorite things about Livingstone is that he founds the Detroit Publishing Company, a really important early firm that produces images for mass distribution all over the United States. And early in their existence, 1897, Livingstone brings to town a guy by the name of William Henry Jackson, who has already established himself as one of the United States' most important photographers of Western scenes. This downtown Denver shot on the bottom is an example of his work, colorized in later years. On the upper right there, you'll see him on a train, in a train car owned by the Detroit Publishing Company, and he would continue these exploits in the West during his years with the Detroit Publishing Company, but to a much more limited degree than he did beforehand in the 1880s and 1890s, where he was pretty much an explorer of the West with U.S. surveying teams. That's where the picture with the horse comes from, when he was part of a U.S. government team doing land surveying out west. So again, a really super important firm, a really interesting wrinkle in Livingstone's life. Livingstone's life is also memorialized by another Albert Kahn design, again is illustrating that the connection goes deeper than just the single residence. A few years after Livingstone dies, Kahn designs the William Livingstone Memorial Lighthouse on I believe it's the eastern extreme of Belle Isle. You have to walk to get there. You can just barely see it from the road, but to really get a nice close-up view, you do have to walk to it. It's clad in marble, which is very uncommon for a lighthouse. It's mostly decorative and symbolic, and it's also got great sculpture by a Hungarian by the name of Geza Marodi, who also happens to be the main sculptor for the Fisher Building. Kahn brings him to town a few different times. And we'll see on some of the sculptural details, right there on the lower left, you guys might not be able to read it, but it does mention that he was the former president of the Lake Carriers Association, probably his most prominent and important position during his lifetime. Let's move on now back to Ferry Street, third demolished residence we're looking at to open the lecture. And this is the Watson M. Freer residence, another unbelievably important and prominent and wealthy citizen of Detroit in this era. Another great collection of photos held by the Burton Historical Collection. Well, Freer, he makes his money in shipping. He's one of the major partners in a firm that produces railroad cars in an era when railroad cars are super, super important. And he's also a part of a shipbuilding firm that we'll see in this clipping right here. And look at who our directors are. Frank J. Hecker, he's the guy that builds the French Chateauesque mansion right there on Woodward at the corner of Ferry. You guys have probably noticed it. It's a really massive, one of the most cool mansions of the area that still survives. We also have James McMillan. He ends up becoming a senator eventually, or congressman, maybe not senator. And Frank E. Kirby, he's one of the most important naval architects in United States history. So he's really rubbing elbows with some very important guys in his over the course of his career. He comes from New York, Kingston, New York, and again, he does make his wealth in freight and shipping. After he gets rich in Detroit, he actually returns to New York and spends the last 2 decades of his life living in Kingston. But for some reason, when he passes away in 22, he has his body brought back to Detroit to be interred at a mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery on Woodward at the north side of Detroit, next to Frank J. Hecker, who built the French Chateauesque mansion. And their mausoleum, Hecker's mausoleum, is designed by McKim, Mead & White. This is one of the most important architectural firms in American history, and also Albert Kahn's favorite architectural firm. One more really important point about Freer, he's the brother of Charles Lang Freer. And Freer had a home on Ferry as well that was named the Merrill Palmer Institute for many years. Maybe some of you have toured it before. Freer was an art collector, and his collection formed the basis of the Smithsonian's collection because he willed his entire collection to the organization that became the Smithsonian at the end of his life. So Freer is actually much more important to American history than his brother Watson, but for Detroit history, I would say they're probably equally important because Watson spent most of his life making his money here. But a really important, interesting wrinkle in his life. So let's move on now to our first structure that is still standing. We're in the Brush Park area of Detroit again. Hold on, I'm going to get another drink of water real quick. The Bernard Ginsberg residence stands at 236 Adelaide in Detroit, built in 1898, designed while Kahn is still in partnership with Nettleton. This home has got some great original wood carvings on it. These are well over 125 years old at this point, or right around 125 years old. And the current homeowner is a very well-informed guy who, he has not presented the primary evidence to me, but he tells me that these sculptures were modeled by Julius Melchers, an important artist of Detroit's past, who, along with his father Gary, was instrumental in helping Kahn get his first job with Mason and Rice. They're really in pretty decent shape. I've cleaned them up a lot in my photographs, but really great representatives of the kind of wood sculpture that goes on homes of the era. Bernard Ginsberg was born in Columbus, Indiana in 1863. He's in the steel and iron business. In the clipping here on the right, they describe him as a junk dealer, leading me to wonder if maybe the word junk has become a little bit more pejorative in the modern era and maybe wouldn't have been considered an insult in Ginsberg's lifetime. Well, Ginsberg, he does make a lot of money in the steel and iron business, and he's wields a lot of influence in Detroit. He's on the public library board, which actually results in him having a library named for him. He's also a former president of Temple Beth El, and this is another important connection because Kahn ends up designing 2 Temple Beth Els over the course of his lifetime, and his association with Ginsberg almost certainly contributes to him earning that commission. Ginsberg dies in Detroit in 1931, survived by 2 daughters and 1 son, and he is buried at Woodmere Cemetery I have photographed his gravesite, and it's really nice. We're going to look at it in a second. But first, let's look at the Bernard Ginsberg branch of the Detroit Public Library. Looking pretty rough, but still standing. And when it's still standing, there's always hope that maybe somebody's going to revive it. This isn't a Kahn design. This is by Mildner and Eisen, an important firm of the day. But I just wanted to include it to underscore how much influence Ginsberg wields with the Detroit Public Library Board at this point in his life, that he gets a library named after him. Here's his gravesite at Woodmere Cemetery, and the carvings on it are uncannily similar to what Parducci and his masters in New York City are producing in this era, leading me to speculate for many years now that Kahn, who brought these sculptors, who gave these sculptors work intended for Detroit more than any other architect in the era, that he probably had something to do with designing Ginsberg's gravesite here, but I've never found primary evidence to prove it outright. But still, again, the sculpture absolutely uncannily similar to what Parducci and his other associates in New York City are doing in this era. The Temple Beth-El, also known as the Bonsall Theater. I drove by this just yesterday, and guess what? You see that horrible whitish panel over the top of the Bonsall Theater awning there? It's gone now, and they have revealed the classical sculptural elements inside. They look really rough. They need a cleaning, but when they're done rehabbing this building, it's going to be a phenomenal. They're building an 8-story hotel right next to it, too, and this is going to be their event center, to the best of my knowledge. So really great to see a classic Detroit building like this being revived, and they're attempting to bring it back to its original look. And the Temple Beth-El, they later build a temple further up Woodward in 22, both Albert Kahn Designs, both commissions that likely resulted in some part because of his association with Ginsberg. Let's move to Ann Arbor now for our 5th entry in the lecture. This is the Professor Edward DeMille Campbell residence, built in 1899, designed by Nettleton and Kahn. Who went to U of M? All right, so who knows about the rock right at the corner of Washtenaw Hill? Yeah, exactly. This house is right across the street on the same side as Hill, but there's a big hedge around it, so you can barely see it. This is like super primo real estate in early Ann Arbor, right next to the university, for a very important faculty member. And this commission, it probably assists in Kahn building the trust with the university community that later results in him securing tons of U of M commissions that are really important. This commission is considered so important that it's reported in the Free Press a couple times, which isn't always the case with Ann Arbor residences. So this kind of underscores how important Campbell is to the university community. When Campbell passes away in 1925, the Ann Arbor News, of course, they publish a large obituary, but the archive is looking a little rough, isn't it, folks? How am I supposed to learn anything about this guy? Well, what you hope for in situations like this is that the person is prominent enough that somebody else has written an obituary. Sure enough, the Industrial and Engineering Chemistry Journal of this era considers him important enough that they include an obituary that is fully legible. Thank you. And through this obit, I was able to learn quite a bit more about him. Born in Detroit in 1863, his father was a Michigan Supreme Court justice and U of M law professor. He is a professor of chemistry and metallurgy, and he is blinded by a lab experiment in 1892, but continues his career, publishes 77 contributions to the research literature of his profession, most of which occur after he's blinded, which to me makes him absolutely fascinating. Who can continue as a lab scientist after they've been blinded? That involves a lot of super abstract thinking up top. It's kind of like Beethoven composing while he's deaf. So he dies in 1925 in Ann Arbor, survived by his widow, 6 children, and 7 grandchildren, and he has a very modest burial site at Forest Hill Cemetery right next to his wife. And if you'd like to learn more about Campbell, because he is a fascinating figure from U of M's past, there's a great article that U of M posts. U of M is great about keeping up with their history and making it available to the public. If you Google Edward DeMille Campbell and the University of Michigan, this will be among your top results, a short biography written by Kim Clark. Highly recommended. All right, in Oakland County now, our first representative in Oakland County is a demolished residence, and I added this residence to my lecture because I recently debuted this lecture just a few weeks ago at the Rochester Hills Museum at Van Hoosen Farm, and they specifically requested that I include the Chapman residence because it formerly stood right in the heart of downtown Rochester. Got a lot of great historical images of this building, unfortunately torn down, I believe, in the 1980s. So who is Chapman? Well, Chapman is the, I'm sorry, before we talk about who Chapman is, I would like to just look one close look at this other image of Chapman's house here. Look at this house back here. It looks like it's right on his property, doesn't it? Gets hardly any mentions in newspapers throughout the year, but I did find one old article about it in the Rochester era from 1906. And this, not incontrovertible proof, but it does show that this is almost certainly the building we're talking about. And the author, in very modern language, describes this cottage as tasty twice in the article, which to me is really 21st century language. So I'm really tickled by that clipping there. And also, it's the only information I've ever been able to find about the accompanying cottage. Could be a Kahn design. There's not really primary evidence to prove it. But when you have a record with one architect building your main residence, not too uncommon to have them come in for the secondary residence as well. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about Chapman's life. Who's dined or had a beer at Rochester Mills? So Rochester Mills is in a building that used to be known as the Western Knitting Mills. Western Knitting Mills was the company that Chapman held a lot of power at. He was the secretary and treasurer, if I'm not mistaken. His brother, William, was the vice president, and there was a ringleader. I can't remember the ringleader's name at the time, but he wasn't a Chapman. But anyway, this is how they made their money, and they were really important to early Rochester history. This is one of the earliest industries in Rochester, and it was one of the biggest knitting mills in the United States at the time it existed as a knitting mill. Most of architectural historians date that Rochester Mills building to 1896. Not a Kahn design, by the way, but important for the purposes of our discussion. But I suspect it might be a little bit later. I suspect it might be 1903 because the Rochester era article here talks about how it's a new building on numerous occasions. And in my mind, the 1896 date, it might more accurately refer to one of the other knitting mills buildings we see in this image that has been torn down. The building with the tower in the foreground is the one that still stands, although the tower is a complete reproduction based on historic precedents. That part was actually torn down, and architects rebuilt it in the 1990s. But I love this article in the Rochester era because it gives us all kinds of images of the inside of the Western Knitting Mills. In fact, it shows a knitting room with tons of looms. You can see how complex of an operation he has going here. And we also get to look at the inside of the office. Somebody sitting at a desk, possibly Chapman. Hard to say for certain, but it very likely could be. This is where Chapman spent a ton of his time. Well, Chapman, there's not a ton about him in the press during his lifetime. He's not a total press hound, but he does get mentioned here and there. And one of the most interesting things about his life is that he's the first person in Rochester to own an automobile. In an era where the United States, American citizens, they're not sure yet that the automobile is here to stay. I think we are now. But at this point, a lot of people questioned whether the automobile was going to be more reliable than horses. And Chapman is mentioned in the Pontiac Daily Press about his driving his new car from Detroit to town, $2,500 vehicle. That's a ton of money in 1904. And over the next few months, they kind of poke fun at him a little bit because his car keeps breaking down and he has to keep getting work on it to get it running well. Well, by the next year, he feels that he has his car running in good enough shape that he can take a trip to Vermont. This is an insanely long trip by automobile in 1905. In fact, probably a lot of people looked at him like he was crazy. But he's going to do it. He's got the time and means, apparently. And the clipping regarding his trip I found so hilarious that I'm actually going to read the whole clipping to you because poor Charlie Chapman, his trip doesn't go as well as he wants it to. Charles S. Chapman, head of the big woolen mills here, left the little Connecticut village of his birth many years ago, a poor lad, and went west to seek his fortune. He prospered so well that among other things he can now afford is a big touring automobile. This summer, he decided to revisit the old Nutmeg home and take the family along in the auto. It was to be a run of something like 800 miles, but Mr. Chapman had the time and means to make it. Members of his brother William's family went there ahead on the train and talked so that villagers were all anticipation for the arrival of the poor lad who had become so rich that he traveled just like the rich New York knobs in a machine that he owns himself. One fine afternoon, the scouts reported a farm team coming into the village on the West Road, pulling a big auto containing a family party. A farm team, for those of you who don't know, is a team of horses pulling Chapman's car. After running all the way from Rochester without a mishap, and when within 2 miles of the Connecticut village, a piece of the machinery went to smash, and with it dashed the plans to roll into the village like all rich men naturally like to roll in among the people who knew them when they were barefoot boys. I wouldn't have it happen for money, says Charlie. The meanest jab of all was from an old villager who remembered me as a boy and who wanted to know if the horses pulled the machine all the way from Michigan and suggested that I buy a machine that will go without horses. Poor Charlie Chapman. So again, not a lot available in the newspapers of the day, but I thought these anecdotal pieces were absolutely fantastic. Unfortunately, Chapman's life comes to a very unfortunate end in 1912. Around 1910, he is afflicted with a long-term illness, and he takes a sabbatical to Europe. Probably, it doesn't say so, but probably sees some doctors over there. Nobody's able to adequately treat his ailment that, these days he probably would have gotten a diagnosis and, doctors might have been able to have some effectiveness. But back then, whatever he had, they didn't know what it was. And he ended up at the Pontiac State Hospital for a few months in the last year of his life, and he ended up choking on a piece of bread at his dinner, and I believe he was in his early 50s at that point. So Chapman, he was born in Vermont in 1864. The Western netting mills that he was a leader of that actually started in Detroit in the late 1880s, 1890s. It was incorporated in 1891, but presumably ran unincorporated a few years before that. He also had lumber interests and banking interests. He was a director of the First National Bank of Rochester, and also had some ownership of some forests, some managed timber in Wisconsin. And he was survived by his widow and 2 children, and he had his body shipped back to Vermont to be buried at Perkinsville Cemetery near his boyhood home of Proctorsville. There's one remnant of Chapman's home left in downtown Rochester at 714, which was his address. We will find a tiny little pillar there of rough-hewn stone. It's very hard to get an attractive photo of it because it's not an attractive pillar anymore. But there's also a little plaque right next to it that talks about how the home formerly stood at this location. The author says that this is only one of a few designed by Mr. Kahn. Not exactly accurate. He designed quite a few residences over the course of his life, as we're learning here tonight. Right down the road from us, we have the Cranbrook House, formerly known as the George Gow and Ellen Scripps Booth residence. First wave is built in 1907, but it gets a lot of additions over the years. I'm guessing pretty much everyone in this room has paid a visit to Cranbrook at one point in their life and probably know a little bit about Booth. But for those of you who don't, he came also from Ontario, as many men did at that point in American history. Came here in 1881. He married Ellen Scripps Booth, who was a daughter of Edmund James Scripps. Edmund James Scripps, who was the owner of the Evening News Association, which was basically what became the Detroit News. So Booth pretty much inherited his father's newspaper legacy and expanded it. He was an early member of the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts and served on the committee that financed the founding of the Center for Creative Studies, also known as College of Creative Studies. He's a co-founder of the Cranbrook Educational Community along with his wife, and he also was kind of the Hearst of our area during his lifetime because he owned so many newspapers, but he wasn't as politically controversial as Hearst. Died in 1949 in Detroit, I believe at the hospital, but he lived in the Cranbrook House up to his death. His wife passed away the previous year, and he's buried at one of my favorite cemeteries in the entire metro area, Greenwood Cemetery in Birmingham, because it packs so many important people in such a small place. If you guys haven't explored Greenwood Cemetery, highly, highly recommend it. Kahn's association with Booth leads to quite a few other commissions, including St. Dunstan's Playhouse right here on Lone Pine Road. This is originally built as an open-air building, and the arches are filled in by Eero Saarinen's father Eliel in 1934 to make it a year-round building. The Cranbrook Tower Cottage is also a Kahn design, as is the Ralph and Mary Stone residence known as Stoneleigh on Cranbrook Road there between Lone Pine and Woodward, I want to say. I'm pretty sure I got that correct. We'll cover that house later in the lecture, actually. One other aspect of Cranbrook House that I can't resist mentioning is the still room. This is a room that is thoroughly decorated in plaster works created by Parducci's first master in New York City, Ulysses Ricci. This is part of an addition to the Cranbrook House that happens in 1918. Thank you to Cranbrook Archivist for sharing these images with me that I can share with you tonight. If you ever get a chance to tour the Cranbrook House, or you haven't, try to go on one of the tours where they show you the still room. Absolutely beautiful. This is just a fraction of the decorative plaster you'll find in this room. Booth also works closely with Kahn on the design of the Detroit News Building downtown. It is considered one of Kahn's top commercial designs. I tend to agree with that conclusion. Some architectural historians consider Booth's contribution so important that they co-attribute the design of this building to him. Others say, that's overdoing it. But still, Booth is really super interested in the decorative arts and knows a lot about, the East Coast sculptural scene from which Kahn gets his sculptors at this point in history. Booth also commissions Kahn to create the grave markers for his father, Henry Wood and Clara Gagne Booth. These are at Greenwood Cemetery, about 90 feet away from the Booth plot, about 90 feet west. They lay flat. Kahn, he subcontracts Corrado Parducci, and Parducci produces, I'm sorry, I don't have a close-up of it. The flowered trim on the outside is Parducci design, and exactly in his wheelhouse, actually. He probably had some input on the letter forms used here for the engraving as well. Moving on now to the Benjamin Siegel residence. We're back in the city limits of Detroit in the Boston Edison neighborhood. This house, unfortunately, was the site of a murder recently, so you may have seen it in the paper in the last few years. The murder remains unsolved, unfortunately, so kind of a dark, not fun twist to this house's story. But moving on to Benjamin Siegel's story. Siegel is a department store developer, and he's really unbelievably important. Siegel's is one of the larger department stores between New York and Chicago, who have Macy's and some bigger names in their cities. But Siegel's most of his career takes place in Detroit, and because he's so successful, we get a lot of different looks at how his appearance changes over the years between the Free Press and the News. He passes away in 1936. Over the course of the Siegel's existence in Detroit, they really create great advertisements for the News and the Free Press. This one is of particular interest to me because I feel the artist here is trying to rip off one of my favorite illustrators, Aubrey Beardsley. Not sure if any of you have heard of him, but Google him when you get home, and I think you'll agree that there's a very obvious stylistic similarity here. Siegel comes to the United States from Germany in 1860. He's born in Germany in 1860. He comes to the United States in 1876. He spends his first 5 years in Selma, Alabama. Comes to Detroit in 1881, works for a different department store for a few years, and he sets out on his own in 1885. He's a member of Franklin Hills Country Club, which is important because Franklin Hills hires Kahn in 1925 to design their clubhouse. Almost certainly, Kahn's association with Siegel plays into that, getting that commission. Siegel dies in 1936. He's survived by his widow, Sophie, and daughter, Eleanor, and he is interred in a private family mausoleum at Woodmere. It's a pretty nice one, too. Kahn also produces a home design for his brother-in-law, Joseph Siegel. I know what you're thinking. Why are Siegel and Siegel have the same name if he's his brother-in-law? Because Siegel married a woman whose last name was also Siegel. In fact, I think if we went looking really deep into it, we might find out that they're first cousins, which was not at all uncommon in that era. I have grandparents that were first cousins, just for the record. So did Farducci's first master, Ulysses Ricci. He married his first cousin also. So kind of a little interesting wrinkle there. Moving right into our area again, we're right back by Cranbrook. This is on the other side of Lone Pine Road in the neighborhood back behind Christ Church, 435 Goodhue Road. This is a massive residence designed for Frank L. Klingensmith and built in the 1910s. It's also got a little garage and carriage house on the opposite side of their massive driveway that's constructed with this really nice fieldstone, and I was able to prove that's also a Kahn design by examining original drawings at the present-day corporation. I am not sure if this is a single-family home or if this has been divided into apartments. Does anybody here happen to know? Does anybody know anybody who lives here? Oh, well, shoot. I was hoping somebody would. This is the most likely group of people. But anyway, it may be divided into apartments now. I can't say for certain, but it's definitely a colossal house designed for a guy that held a lot of power at Ford Motor Company. In fact, he is the successor to the roles of James J. Couzens, who we're going to cover in just a second, U.S. Senator out of Detroit. If we look at the Polk City Directory on the upper left here, we'll see at that point he's living at 94 Massachusetts in Highland Park. Highland Park, a lot of auto executives used to live in Highland Park. It was a very fancy destination for executives at both Chrysler and Ford for many years, believe it or not. But that 94 Massachusetts address, that was also a Kahn design. It's been torn down since and replaced with something else, but just an interesting note there. Because, Kahn's association with Ford is closer than it is with any other auto manufacturer. He just designs a ton for Ford over the years, and that is almost certainly where the association forms that leads to Kahn designing a home for Klingensmith. Klingensmith, after he leaves Ford, I believe it was in 1921. Actually, I believe he leaves Ford, it was in 1921, and he walks right into the role as the president of Gray Motors. This is absorbed by Studebaker in 1926, and I want to say Studebaker is eventually absorbed into maybe General Motors. Don't quote me on that, though. But Gray produces really great cars for just a few years, but like so many industries in banking and both automobiles back then, there's just constant mergers and corporate name changes, so it only lasts a few years. Klingensmith was born in Pittsford, Michigan in 1879, came to Detroit in 1900, held many roles at Ford over the years, vice president, general manager, and co-director at the time of his resignation. He died in 1949 in Birmingham, Michigan. He did have some other roles later in life. He worked for the American Home Concrete Pipe Company, maybe American Hume. I think this is a typo in the article there, though. And at the time of his death, he is survived by a widow, 2 sons and a daughter, and another really important name that is interred at Greenwood Cemetery in Birmingham. Let's now move on to the Ralph and Mary Stone residences. I'm just now realizing there's like 3 homes in my lecture here that you guys can literally go drive by right after we're done here. I mean, they're all like within a mile. The Ralph and Mary Stone residence is on Cranbrook Road, right between Woodward and Lone Pine. And it also has a nice little guest house and garage. And if you look closely, you'll note that this is the design is constructed almost exclusively from cinder block, which is a pretty darn common and simple and not considered a rich man's building material usually. But in the right hands, a person like Albert Kahn, we can do something pretty graceful with it. Ralph Stone is born in Wilmington, Delaware in 1868. He graduates Swarthmore College in 1889 and graduates U of M Law in 1892. But the most important part of his career is probably when he is taken on as the private secretary to Governor Hazen S. Pingree right at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. And this position allows him to make a lot of important banking connections in the state, and he ends up being one of the founders of a trust out of Grand Rapids, Michigan Trust Company, I believe it's called, and it's the first trust company in Michigan. And that eventually leads to his involvement in the Detroit Trust Company, a company that I believe is eventually absorbed a lot of different name changes and eventually becomes part of Comerica. He serves as their president from 15 to 27 and the chairman from 27 to 33. He's also a Cranbrook Foundation trustee. He's involved with the Sons of the American Revolution. And he dies at his apartment at the Whittier, right over by Indian Village on the other side of Jefferson in 1956. And he goes back to Grand Rapids, is interred at Oak Hill Cemetery. I'm not sure if he's in a mausoleum or he's buried. So what's the connection to Kahn? Well, Kahn designed the Detroit Trust Company building, 201 West Fort Street in 1915. If we look at this clipping right here, this one right here, we can see that this building was only 1/3 its present size when it was first built. It was either this wing or this wing that was built first, and then in 26-27, they tripled the size of the building. That's Kahn Design also. And it's interesting to me because both of these builds, they coincide with Stone's elevation to positions of prominence. In 1915, when he gets the presidency, that's when they build the first wing. And in 1927, when he gets the chairmanship, that's when they build the next two wings. Probably just a coincidence, but maybe not. Maybe the extra power he wields allows him to talk the board into expending money on hiring Kahn as an architect. And one other really interesting note about this residence, Charles Lindbergh here lived with his wife from July 1942 to August 1943 when he was working for the Ford Motor Company, and his rent was $300 a month. Wouldn't that be nice? That comes out to less than my tax bill. Let's now look a little bit further in Oakland County. We're on entry number 11 now. We're doing 15, just to remind you. This is the R. Elford Plum residence on Cambridge, which is probably one of the nicest streets in Pleasant Ridge, which is a very pleasant little suburb just north of Ferndale. Really nice looking steeply pitched roof there, though, which is kind of, Kahn does that quite a few times over the course of his career. Plum, he's not a guy that gets a ton of press over the course of his career, but he does end up in the paper periodically. On the right, we have evidence of a birthday party, and I believe, what is this on the end? It shows that he's involved with the Rotary too. But the reason that he's connected with Kahn is because Kahn's brother, he's an executive at Trustcon, a company that sells building materials and is founded by Kahn's brother Julius, who is the real pioneer of reinforced concrete. He's the one that does all the lab experiments, testing loads and things like this. Kahn is just able to implement his brother's ideas into building designs. So Plum, he's an executive here for, I want to say, close to 40 years. And they're just a huge company. They're just selling building products all over the United States over the course of their existence. Plum is born in Gaines, Michigan in 1883, executive at Trustcon for over 40 years, died in 1954, survived by his widow Edna, 2 sons and 5 grandchildren, and buried right in Berkeley in my hometown. I live on Berkeley at 11.5 Mile. Senator James J. Couzens, definitely one of the most important figures that we're going to talk about tonight. His importance to Detroit's history is unbelievable. Kahn designs quite a few different structures for him over the course of his career. The first residence he designs for him is actually in Boston Edison. I believe this one's vacant at the moment. Hopefully there's a buyer. That little carport on the right, that got added later and is not sympathetic to the Kahn design, so we don't like that. But also right here in our general neighborhood on Wabaque Lake Drive East, Kahn constructs for Couzens what is known as Wabaque Manor. And also right in the same neighborhood, the owners of Wabaque Manor, boy, they were really generous with me when I was writing my book. They were out of town, because they're snowbirds that go down to Florida, and it was still late spring, so it was kind of cold. And they were like, "Oh, we're out of town, we're retired, we're down south, but you go on our lot whenever you want, and you take as many nighttime photographs as you like," which I thought was really super generous and inviting of them. So I do have a lot of different looks at this beautiful structure. Also right in the same neighborhood, in 1910 and 1913, Couzens has a farm constructed. This is about where Manchester Court is in this neighborhood now. This is all torn down stuff, but Wabaque's property just dominated this neighborhood in the early parts of the 20th century. Also in downtown Birmingham, right there on Maple, we'll find the Wabaque building. This is built as Couzens' offices in Birmingham at a time when he's serving as a U.S. Senator. And also there's a Frank Cousins construction company who built the building that has offices in here after it opens too. I presume that Frank is related to James Cousins, but I don't know that for 100%, so don't quote me on that one. Hold on, just gonna get another sip here real quick. Who remembers that maple construction from a few summers ago? Boy, that was annoying, wasn't it? It gave me a great opportunity to get a night shot, though, that nobody can duplicate unless they wait, 50 years for the next time they rebuild Maple Road. Cousins came here from Ontario, as many West people with their eyes on the West were doing at this point in American and North American history. Came to Detroit in 1890. He was an early investor in Ford, and Ford's third attempt to create a company, it made those investors very rich, all of them. He stays with Ford and serves in power roles for about a decade. He's the director, vice president, treasurer, general manager at different points in his career. But he leaves Ford in 1916 to try his hand at politics. He serves as Detroit's police commissioner from 1916 to 1918. He's the mayor from 1918 to 22, and he's a U.S. senator from 1922 to 1934, and he passes away in 1934, interred in a private mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery. Just a few great photos of his family that I hunted down on Wikimedia in their Commons area. I love the one on the right because it shows this great combination of the sternness and the seriousness we want from a politician. But he's also a little bit surprised by the flash there, don't you think? So I think that one's kind of amusing. Also, really great period dress worn by his wife and daughters. Really love this family portrait. His mausoleum at Woodmere, also an Albert Kahn design, built in 1920. And the doors are sculpted by Parducci's masters back in New York City at a time when Parducci's getting assigned most of the work in Ricci's studio that's destined for Detroit. So really great circumstantial argument for Parducci having sculpted these doors. But if not Parducci, probably Ulysses Ricci. So really, really great public example here that you can just walk right up to and touch anytime you care to go down to Woodlawn Cemetery. In Huntington Woods, south of here, just south of my city of Berkeley, we have a home that Kahn's father lived in for the last 7 years of his life. This is on York Road on a stretch that's really well taken care of with a bunch of other lovely homes. And Kahn's father, he was an interesting guy. He acted as a rabbi, author, and lecturer at different points of his life. Born in Germany in 1845, made the immigration to the United States in 1881 with the rest of the family. 7 of his 8 children survived at the time of his death, and he is buried at the Kahn family plot at Woodmere Cemetery. Let's take a look at that real quick. Really interesting part of Kahn's family story. Kahn and his wife, though, they're cremated and they're interred at Whitechapel Cemetery at the mausoleum in Troy. Not sure why they decided to not be buried alongside their family, but an interesting historical note. I also speculate that somebody in Kahn's offices probably rendered the Kahn monument for the family plot here. Kahn's mom, dad, and 2 brothers are buried at this site. Back in our kind of general area, we're not super close to this, but at 520 Aspen Road in Birmingham, we'll find the Henry E. Edwards residence, built in 1930. Quite a handsome structure here. Edwards, he's born in Albion, Michigan in 1863. He is the postmaster for a number of years, appointed personally by William McKinley. In Jackson, where most of his professional history takes place, he's a prosecutor, he's into banking, manufacturing, and he moves to Birmingham in 1930, right into an Albert Kahn Design house. How did that happen? We'll find out in a second. In his time here in Southeast Michigan, he becomes the chairman of the board at Birmingham's National Bank, and at the time of his death, he is survived by his wife, a daughter, a son, 5 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchildren, and he is also interred at Whitechapel Memorial Park Cemetery in Troy. I'm not sure if he's buried or if he's got a mausoleum interment. So how does this guy from Jackson just, hey, I'm going to move to Detroit, and I'm moving right into an Albert Kahn house? When I started reading up on his life, I was like, there has to be a connection that precedes his move here. Well, it didn't take much digging to figure out that he was on the board of the People's National Bank. 1926 ad from the Jackson Citizen Patriot makes the case. And in 1929, the People's National Bank, it merges with the National Union Bank and Trust Company. And right in that year, 1929, they become the Union and People's National Bank, and Albert Kahn designs a building for them with Corrado Parducci sculpture right on the front. In terms of aesthetics here, we can't really compete with the Fisher Building, can we? But it's still a useful building that still stands today and is used as Jackson County offices, and it's got some great interior plasterwork, so it's definitely worth a look, especially for the epic faces that Parducci produces for the front of the building. And this underscores the relationship with Edwards that Kahn clearly has to at least some degree before Edwards moves to town in 1930. Interesting note about this residence: after Edwards passes away in 1933, Ernestine Kahn, Kahn's widow, purchases the home and lives the next 9 years of her life here. Oh, it's your house. Did you share that with me? Back in about 2013?
That's my handwriting.
That's awesome. So thank you so much for doing that, because that was back when I was first starting to get into really seriously studying the Kahn legacy. And I would knock on a lot of doors back then to see, if the homeowners had any additional information about the history. And this kind lady here said, we've got some old deed information that shows Ernestine used to own it. And I was like, that sounds awesome. Do you mind sharing it with me? Thank you very much for that. Really, really cool. So that photo, I'm sorry, I'm talking out of turn here, but I'm going to tell you anyway because it's a funny story. When I made that photo, it was when I was getting ready for the book, so I probably made it in 2021. And one of your neighbors did not like that I was photographing your house. She's like, do I need to call the police? And I'm like, well, I'm not doing anything illegal, so you can if you want to. But I was real nice and polite with her and didn't cop an attitude, and that kind of she took it easy after that. No police were called, thankfully. But if you like the photo of your house, I'd be glad to share it with you.
But I think it's funny not to hijack.
Oh, go ahead.
We live across the street from Ed and Jane Julak on Aspen, and if anyone here knows their house, it's like the nicest house in Birmingham, with giant hedges, and no one looks at our house. Everyone walks down Jane and Ed's sidewalk and tries to peer through the hedges at their house. And we just sit and watch them through our windows and laugh.
Well, it's a really lovely block. Kahn, I think, does have a tendency towards the utilitarian even in his residential designs. Some of them he gets away from that, like Willestead Manor in Canada, or maybe Cranbrook House, where he does get very ostentatious. But for me, for the most part, I really feel like the coolest thing about his residences is that he tries to keep it simple, and some of them end up really super graceful. This one's got a different color masonry for the front entrance, so it kind of is a little bit more complex than we would usually see in an Albert Kahn residential design. But for the most part, I feel like Kahn, when his best residences, like the Siegel residences, they're really understated. There's not a lot of flauntiness. It's like a gestalt, one statement kind of thing, I wouldn't say that this house really shows off that tendency, but I really do like this one a lot because it is different. And most likely in 1930, this was almost certainly delegated to a designer in the office, and Kahn just looked over their shoulder, which is the case for most Kahn designs after, the 1910s. Our last entry tonight, how far over have I gone? Ooh, kind of a ways. Sorry, hope nobody's fallen asleep yet, but this is definitely one of the most interesting entries. A log cabin designed by Kahn's company in his lifetime. When I first discovered that this was a Kahn design, a lot of local Kahn historians were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe it. But I actually examined original drawings at the Bentley Historical Library on the North Campus of the University of Michigan. And also, it was built for Edgar A. Kahn, Kahn's son, so that's another element of the proof that makes it pretty incontrovertible. Also, the current renter of this home came into possession of some original blueprints produced by the Multicolor Corporation. That's a corporation founded by Kahn's sister Molly and her father Joseph, and they were really pioneers in the development of high-speed blueprint reproduction. So another really great, important historical timepiece related to this construction. Kahn, the son, he's a really fascinating figure too. He's born in Detroit in 1900. He is on the very first hockey team for the University of Michigan and scores the team's very first goal. And in their second year, he is the team captain. He serves as a U.S. Armed Forces surgeon during World War II in many different field hospitals. And he serves as the head of neurosurgery at U of M Hospital from 49 to 69, a super, super important position. I also happen to know one of his daughters, and she's a good friend of mine, Carol Rose Kahn. Kahn, you can learn a lot more about his life and his connection to the university, once again, by just Googling his name and the University of Michigan. They're so great about maintaining their history in so many different ways. All of these images were borrowed from their website. But to me, the most interesting chapter of Kahn's life is his service as a field surgeon during World War II. This passage that I'm going to read to you in its entirety is taken directly from one of his letters that was included in a book called Albert Kahn and His Life and Family, written by a guy named Martin Brashear, who married into the Kahn family. And the reason I love this passage so much is, to me, that it really perfectly exemplifies the heroism that we so often associate with overseas military service. Sometimes I get a little choked up when I read it, so I hope you guys will bear with me. In late April of 1945, a soldier was brought in with a missile wound of the spine and complete paralysis of the legs. I was busy, looked at him only briefly, and said we would operate as soon as possible. The anesthesia was started with the patient lying on his back. The x-ray of the spine was shown to me, and there was a large, long mass rounded at one end in the spinal canal. I didn't think much of it, but when the patient was turned over, I could see orange paint in the depths of the wound. A captain of ordnance, a patient at the hospital, was sent for. When he saw the x-ray and the orange paint, he said that what we had was an unexploded 20-millimeter German anti-aircraft shell. Although it had not gone off on impact, he said, any twist might set it off. I called Colonel Hall Holder, the chief of surgery, who said I should wait and not do anything. He called the Surgeon General's office and was told that a bomb disposal squad would be at the hospital within 45 minutes. We stood around. Both Gordy and Hahn wanted to remove the shell, but I said nothing doing. I was getting more and more restless and tense. I figured I could not wait another 30 minutes and still operate. Besides, the patient, now face down, was under anesthesia. I sent everyone, including the anesthetist, out of the room, put on a sterile glove, got under the heavy marble French operating table. In case it explodes, he'll only lose his hand and arm. And with my left hand, reached into the wound and took hold of the shell. To my surprise, it came out easily. I had expected it to be embedded in the spinal canal. I carried the shell out of the room and gingerly laid it in a container in the sterilizing room. The team was called back, the wound was redraped, and we commenced the debridement and closure. While we were operating, the head of the 6 main hospitals in Paris, a Colonel Parsons, arrived with a bomb disposal squad. They disappeared with the shell. It was time to go home. So yeah, Eddie, fascinating guy. Highly recommend you look into him. That concludes my lecture on Albert Kahn's residences tonight, folks. I am sorry to say, thank you. I'm really sorry to say that I am sold out of my book on Albert Kahn. Well, thanks. I need to get a new printing made, though, because I hate missing sales opportunities. I do have my New Orleans Field Guide to Stained Glass and my Corrado Parducci book available, if anybody's interested, though. And, you know, Detroit Artist Market and Pier Detroit, they might still have a couple copies on the shelf. I can tell you for sure that Book Beat in Oak Park is sold out, though. So with that, how much time do we have, David? Can I take some questions? Okay, it looks like we don't have to clear out, so if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to take your questions at this time.
And if they're still recording, if you could repeat the question.
Oh, okay, yeah. Great. I'm going to repeat the question. You still recording there, Connor? Yeah, I'm going to repeat the question, if anybody has any. Looks like you got your hand up first there, sir, in the blue shirt. The question is, have I been inside Wabeek Manor, the Senator James J. Cousins residence that still stands here in Bloomfield? I have not been inside. I've only photographed it from the exterior. If you know the owners and you want to help me get inside, you can promise them that I'll produce a gallery of photos for them in exchange for letting me see the interior. Who's next? Go ahead, ma'am.
Did Albert Kahn design the art museum and the adjacent, I think it's library, and did Parducci do the doors?
So, which museum, first of all?
Crabber.
No. Okay, the question is, did Kahn design did Kahn design the Cranbrook Art Museum, and did Parducci do the sculpture? And the answer to both of them is no. The Cranbrook Art Museum was designed by Eliel Saarinen. That's Eero's father, and he designed the majority of the Kingswood School and I believe it's the girls' upper school or lower school. That's one of the most important commissions of his career, and especially the library, they really bridged the gap from this era of fancy architectural design, where you were expected to have ornament and sculpture on everything, to the era where we get fully streamlined and sculpture almost completely falls away. That is best exemplified by the library. Even though the doors, they have the nice embellishments and stuff, for the most part, that's a really modern-looking building, and that totally illustrates an era of Saarinen's career there, because you can see from the earlier stuff from the 20s that he does get more streamlined and he does get into making it with less ornament on the outside. But the stuff that he does in the 20s is fantastic as well. So Cranbrook has a long, long history of sculptors, and I have not studied who created the sculptural embellishment specifically on that building, but I can tell you that there's quite a few other sculptors that have a deep connection to Cranbrook over the years. My personal favorite is probably a guy by the name of Carl Mill, M-I-L-L-E-S, for any of you who don't know. But he's just one small name in a really long and great tradition of sculptors having residencies at Cranbrook. Also, does anybody know the Galileo doors at Cranbrook? They're on the building with the tower. Those are by Geza Marodi, the guy that we covered earlier, whose sculpture is on the Livingstone Lighthouse there on Belle Isle. So Cranbrook's just unbelievably architecturally rich, and you can't even really say that Kahn dominates there because there's so many contributions by other architects. Yes, Kahn has 4, maybe even 5 buildings throughout the entire campus, but Eliel's got more. And then there's also designs by Marcus Burroughs. Just to name one, I'm drawing a blank on other names at the moment, but it's really an awesome tapestry of important producers there. So the answer to your question is no, but still great fuel for me to be able to talk about the architectural legacy there, which I just think is phenomenal. I love Cranbrook. Yep, go ahead, ma'am, in the lavender pinkish shirt there. The question is, did Parducci do the sculpture on the Cranbrook residence? And I'm going to say no, but I'm going to qualify that. So Cranbrook, its first waves of construction, they're when Parducci's still a child. But later eras, like the still room that I brought up in 1918, so Parducci takes on his first apprenticeship in New York City in 1917 with Ulysses Ricci, the guy who produced the plaster in the still room. So Ricci's got a big studio at that time. And a lot of times when you have a big plaster assignment like that, you're the master. You'll do the fanciest parts of it. But some of the stuff that's repeated and is just a pattern, you'll assign it to your underling. And it's hard to pin down the date where Roland and Kahn begin to take a liking to Parducci and start asking their bosses, hey, we want to give you this contract, but we want Parducci to execute it. But the prevailing theories are that happens around 1919, 1920. So a little bit too late to be involved in the Cranbrook house, but still you can make a speculative argument there. The closest thing to a Cranbrook commission by Parducci, in my opinion, is the grave markers of Booth's parents, because that one is backed up by a ledger entry and other primary evidence. There could be some other examples there, but you don't learn all of Parducci's commissions. His ledger enumerates over 600. I've personally only hunted down about 320 of them. So there's always something new to discover. I'm going to do a third edition to that book in a few years because I've already got like 20 to 30 more that will be added to it. So his career is just massively prolific. There's not one other architectural sculptor in the United States that produces as much as Parducci during that period of United States history. Next. Okay, you, sir?
I'm just going to ask, are you familiar with the library, the Albert Kahn Library at Lawrence Technological University?
Absolutely, and any lecture where I can't fit that in, that's a slight regret of mine. But I do cover it in another lecture I have called Albert Kahn Unintended Consequences. And that covers really unique adaptive renovations and reuses of Albert Kahn Designs space. And for those of you who don't know, Kahn's corporate offices from 1932 to 2018 were located in the New Center building, just north of the Fisher on 2nd Ave in the New Center part of Detroit. Well, after Kahn's death, 3 decades after Kahn's death, in the 1970s, there was a project put together to transplant his library, the original interior decor, and his personal collection of books to the main library at Lawrence Tech University. And you can go into this library these days and look at Kahn's collection of books, which really gives you great insight into how he drew inspiration from architectural journals of the day. He was a voracious consumer of that kind of media.
And so that 50% of the architects in Michigan are Lawrence Technological University graduates.
That's great. Yes, I've heard that.
When you sit in that room, like you just said, you feel Albert Kahn in the room. It is a magnificent room.
I couldn't agree more.
I mean, what the point you made, I just think your presentation was really excellent.
Thanks.
And when I think about Albert Kahn, I think about Highland Park, your comments about Highland Park, and Ford Motor Company and Piquette, where the Model T was born. So it's kind of interesting that you brought all of this to life.
Yeah, well,
Really living.
when you really dig into it, you just find out how unbelievably connected Kahn was to so many things happening in the community, and it becomes kind of unbelievable after a while. I know you were asking about Cranbrook's museum earlier, but I thought you were asking about the DIA at first, and that would also be a no. But Kahn was on the Arts Council that managed the development of that building, and he was one of the people that approved the architect for Philadelphia who did do that design. So even when Kahn is not technically the designer, a lot of times he's got his hands. Detroit Public Schools also, he designed none over the course of his career, but he was known to conference with Malcolmson and Higginbotham, the architects that did the most Detroit Public Schools in the 20s. He was assigned to conference with them by the city. And also his right-hand man, Wirt Rowland, through many years of his career, he was Malcolmson and Higginbotham's head designer in the years in between his 2 stints at Kahn. So you can see how just unbelievably interconnected it is. And I agree with you 100%, sir, about that library. The decor and the appearance is awesome. But the really, really cool thing is Albert Kahn's personal library that gives you a glimpse into his mind. I highly recommend a visit for any of you. Are you an LTU professor or something? Oh, are you still teaching there?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah?
I'll never be proud of it.
Oh, yeah? Take my card before you leave and hire me as a visiting lecturer.
Glad to have you. Carl Greimel would love to have you, as well as Earl Melbourne.
Okay, well, I'm going to step away from the podium and give this guy my card, you guys, because I'm always seeking new business. Who else has got a question?
This is my other hat. I wear a couple of hats. You can reach me with that email.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Don. And your question, ma'am?
What did you say was the source of the big buildings, reinforced or concrete?
Reinforced concrete.
So his brother basically came.
Julius was more of the scientist.
He was the engineer.
Yes, exactly, engineer. So almost all of Kahn's brothers had engineering degrees from U of M that Kahn paid for. Kahn never got a degree. He got honorary degrees from U of M in Syracuse very late in his life, but he was not college educated, but he made sure all of his brothers were.
Younger brother? Oh, he's the oldest.
He's the oldest, that's right. Gustave, the second oldest, I believe, is the only one that didn't get an engineering degree from U of M. And he was a plumber, but he was a really advanced plumber. Some people are like, is Gustave the black sheep? And maybe we don't look on plumbing as, we don't think of it as highly as we think of building designing. But if you really study Gustave's life, you'll find that he actually lectured for industry organizations quite regularly, and he was super accomplished also. I forgot your question, though. Did I answer it? Okay, good deal. Anybody else? All right, it sounds like we're done for the day. Thanks so much, you guys. I really enjoyed it. Hopefully the Bloomfield Historical Society brings me back again sometime.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Have a great day.